Protection Bureau's field hearing on contracts for deed. We want to thank those who have joined us at the University of St. Thomas and St. Paul, Minnesota, and also those of you who are joining us virtually today. My name is Angela Hanks. I serve as Associate Director for External Affairs at the CFPB. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, is a federal agency whose mission is to implement and enforce federal consumer financial law and to ensure fair markets for consumer financial products and ensure those services are fair, transparent, competitive, and free from discrimination. We'll kick off today's hearing on contracts for deed with remarks from a few special guests from the great state of Minnesota. After that, CFPB Director Rohit Chopra will provide remarks and set the stage for a panel discussion with advocates and experts on contract for deed home purchase agreements. Then, following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity to hear from members of the public who have signed up to share their experiences with contract for deed or other financial products. Today's event is being live streamed and subsequently posted at consumerfinance.gov. You can follow CFPB on Twitter and on Facebook. And now I would like to invite our special guests to kick off today's hearing. First, we will hear from U.S. Senator Tina Smith. Senator Smith was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2017. She sits on several committees in the Senate, including the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and she is the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Transportation, and Community Development. Senator Smith, would you like to come to the podium?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Angela, and welcome to Minnesota, Director Chopra. We're so glad to have you here, and thank you for holding this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau field hearing here in Minnesota. And I'm honored to be here today with Lieutenant Governor Flanagan and Attorney General Ellison, and I know that the CFPB leadership and staff are going to learn a lot from our outstanding panelists and local leaders who are here today. So in November of 2022, ProPublica and Sahan Journal published an astonishing story, reporting how unscrupulous real estate sellers were targeting and exploiting Somali Minnesotans by luring them into contracts for deed. In a contract for deed, buyers purchase a property over time directly from a seller without a bank or other lender financing the purchase. Contracts for deed can be a legitimate tool for financing real estate transactions and are frequently used, for example, in ag land purchases. But ProPublica and Sahan Journal told another story about how contracts for deed have been used in Minnesota to exploit and rip people off. These contracts are marketed as interest-free alternatives to traditional mortgage home loans and often target Muslim immigrants who, because of the tenets of their faith, look for alternatives to paying interest on a traditional mortgage. But in too many cases, these contracts are a scam and provide none of the traditional protections that mortgage lending offers. In many cases, they are not actually interest-free. Buyers often don't know what they're getting into because interest costs are obscured in the fine print. Language barriers make the problem worse, and even if you speak fluent English, it's hard, if not impossible, to understand exactly what you're getting into. There are stories of people losing all of their equity and their home because they missed a single payment. Families have been evicted and lost everything that they paid in. And because these are contracts for deed and not mortgages, buyers had none of the protections that mortgages offer, including options for foreclosure rather than forfeiture. The reality? These contracts are often designed to fail. When a buyer can't meet the terms of the contract and with no legal protections, they lose everything: their down payment, the improvements that they made to their home, the money that they paid in, and their home. And then the seller takes the house back and starts the scam all over again with the next hopeful family. And this abuse of contracts for deed is not a niche problem for a few families. A survey conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust found that 36 million home borrowers have used risky alternative home financing arrangements such as land contracts at least once, and that 7 million home borrowers are currently using them. So I was frankly outraged when I heard these stories. And so, I talked to Director Chopra, and I asked him what the Biden-Harris administration could do to protect people. He immediately understood the problem, and he went to work, and I am so grateful that he and the team at the CFPB have taken this challenge seriously and have come to us today to talk about solutions. I'm also grateful that Attorney General Ellison, Governor Walz, and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan have taken swift action at the state level to protect consumers and hold bad actors accountable. This problem is rampant across the country, and Black and brown and immigrant communities, people who have long suffered from housing discrimination, are often the targets. Most states don't have comprehensive laws governing contracts for deed, and the statutes vary significantly from one state to another. The result is legal loopholes where these unscrupulous sellers of contracts for deed rip people off. So we need a federal as well as state action to protect people. Earlier this year, I introduced bipartisan legislation with my colleague Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming to establish a basic level of protection for contracts for deed buyers across all 50 states. So everyone wants a safe, decent place to call home. Without this, nothing in your life works. Not your job, not your family, not your health, nothing works. And owning your own home is the American dream. It's a path to stability and comfort and security. It's a way to build wealth. This American dream should never be a trap to be exploited by disreputable operators who use legal loopholes and bad faith agreements to take advantage of people who don't have the power to protect themselves. So I want to thank everybody for being here today, and especially Director Chopra and the Biden-Harris administration for your work on this important issue and for standing up for people who only want the opportunity to own their own home and live the American dream. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Next, we'll hear from Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. Peggy Flanagan is Minnesota's 50th Lieutenant Governor and a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, would you like to come up to the podium?
Thank you. Well, good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that we are here together, and so just grateful for this conversation and to be able to host you here today. Welcome to Minnesota. I think that all of us in this room know how important these conversations are to community. So many families, as Senator Smith mentioned, who have great big dreams, only to watch those dreams be shattered. And it takes all of us working together to find solutions. We are well aware that Minnesota is a state with great quality of life for so many of us, but we also experience great disparities. We like to humbly trumpet our successes, and we've had a lot of these, and we're proud of them. But we cannot let these successes cloud the work that is in front of us that we have to do. That work is, and I think we all know, substantial. This work is especially true, that work is especially needed in the area of housing. And I want to take some time to just take apart some of these top-line statistics. According to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency's most recent housing disparity report, Minnesota has the third highest home ownership rates in the country. And that's great. That is a great statistic. We can be, and we should be, proud of that. But when we dig a little deeper, though, we see that home ownership rates for Black, Indigenous, and other households of color, it's a little less inspiring. It's 37th highest in the country. 3rd and 37th. That's a huge difference. And we see that we have a lot more work to do. Here in Minnesota, though, we understand that the reason behind these differences, it's not that they're there randomly. They're not just features of the landscape like a lake or a stream or a river. These disparities are there due to years and decades and centuries, really, of disinvestment and exploitation. And I want to take the time to call that out here. We have to name it. So the solutions that we look to here in Minnesota have to center that history. All it takes is a little look underneath the hood at some of these statistics to see that that still holds power. And I'm not here to tell you all that in one of the most historic and really relevant legislative sessions of our time that we solved the problem, or even that the abusive contracts for deed are the entire problem. But I am proud of the steps that we have taken to ensure that in this state, we can stop the worst of these abuses, alongside with our community allies who are here, many of whom who will speak and share their stories, their important stories. Many of these people on this panel will speak in greater depth about what really passed this last session, but I want to call out some of the specific provisions that I'm really happy about. The bill that we passed called out and prohibits the practice of quote-unquote churning, when sellers offer the same piece of property over and over again to buyers and only to terminate the contracts, leaving them with nothing. We're requiring disclosures from sellers of the purchase price of that property and the exact details of that transaction, so that buyers can't be taken by surprise by the red tape or the fine print. We narrowed the instances in which a seller can terminate an agreement, protecting buyers from snap terminations that leave them without a title to property or even a place to sleep at night. We in this administration want housing stability to be possible for all Minnesotans. For many, they would like that stability to come in the form of home ownership, and we place a high value on the existence of inclusive methods of financing. And I will tell you, last fall, my family bought our first home, chipping away slowly at that native home ownership disparity, one family at a time, and it matters tremendously that my daughter has a place to do her homework, a place in the basement for sleepovers, right? A backyard where we can host our family, and everybody should have access to that. That's really what we are talking about today. We recognize that we will need to regulate and clarify processes for home buying other than mortgages, and to do otherwise would be to move backwards in history and fall into some of the same patterns that have left our state with such large disparities of home ownership. That is why, again, I am so appreciative of this conversation and of this hearing. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Director Chopra, for opening this process in this way and for your leadership, and of course, as always, to my incredible colleagues, Attorney General Ellison and Senator Smith. I am honored to be in this fight with you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. And finally, we're joined by Attorney General Keith Ellison. Attorney General Ellison was elected as Minnesota's 30th Attorney General in 2018, and then re-elected in 2022. Prior to that, he served in both Congress and the state legislature. Thank you. Mr. Attorney General, please come up.
Hey, everybody. It's good to see you. Mr. Director, welcome back to Minnesota. Senator Smith, thank you. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, thank you very much. And I always love how you bring it right home to the kids in the backyard. That's where it belongs, doesn't it? I also want to thank my friend Senator Zainab Mohammed, Mahmoud Noor, and I want to thank conversations we've had. I'm drawing a blank on your name right now, but thank you very much. You know who you are. We've talked before, and you're probably going to speak up here because you've been such a champion. But I also want to thank, I see Fartoon Welling is here, and we've had conversations about this exact problem. Because this issue has come to our attention through community engagement. We know about it because friends, motivated and caring about people's economic sustainability, said, hey, what are we going to do? I want to note that this problem of predatory contracts for deed is a symptom of a larger problem of barriers to full and equal opportunity to prosperity for all Americans. We, friends, have got to fight for America being the land of opportunity. For too many of our fellow Americans, it is the land of economic stagnation. And that is because of the rules which we have the power to change. So this May, because of conversations we had, filed a lawsuit against realtor Chadwick Bankin and a number of his companies. Bankin's contracts for deed were so egregious, that means really bad, it's clear that they were designed to fail. They go after vulnerable Minnesotans, people with lower credit scores who couldn't qualify for a traditional mortgage, or people who, because of the tenets of their faith, as Senator Smith said, were looking to buy a home without traditional interest-based financing. Our lawsuit asked the court to enjoin Bankin and his companies from continuing these unlawful practices and to compensate the buyers who are losing their life savings. But we also know that stopping this one group of companies is not enough. That's why we'll also ask the court to impose civil penalties that would make other potential offenders think twice before they try these schemes. That's why my office has supported Minnesota legislation that Lieutenant Governor Flanagan just got through talking about. And I want to commend our Governor Tim Walz, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, and all of our Minnesota state legislators who supported these much-needed reforms. They went into effect on August 1st. So at this point, they're about 13 days old. We need to hear from you if they're working the way they're supposed to. This law prohibits the kind of rapid reselling that Bankin's companies did and requires more disclosure from sellers about contract terms. And that's why we'll continue to push for even more protections for home buyers. Now, this is important work, and we're honored to be able to do it for the people of the state of Minnesota. But why is this work necessary? It's necessary because we've allowed big companies and dishonest businesses to put their fingers on the scales of our economy. Now, a few hundred billionaires hold more wealth than 170 million Americans on the bottom half of our income brackets. We can keep playing whack-a-mole and taking these bad actors on one at a time as they emerge. But unless we unplug that machine and take on the core issue of economic sustainability and prosperity for everyone, they're just going to keep popping up. Indeed, we need to create a prosperity that welcomes everyone, white, black, Native, Latino, Asian, every ethnic group, people of all genders, people of all faiths. We need to create an inclusive economy. We certainly can do it in the United States if we put our minds to it. In fact, with all the problems of the 1950s, and I'm well aware that they were many, one person could support a family of four. About 33% of all people were in a union, or another 33% were paid as if they were. You could aspire to home ownership, you could aspire to health care, you could aspire to education, and we need to create an economy where everybody can aspire again, but also leave the Jim Crow and the sexism aside and create inclusion. But we can do it. It's within our power, and it is hearings like this that are going to get us there. Instead, creating this prosperity that welcomes all is what we have to set our mind to. We can do it if we try. Our work to reform contracts for deed called on us to talk to partners, to get out into the community, to sit down and listen carefully. And I want to let everybody know that you can always call 651-296-3353 if you want to get a hold of the Attorney General's office to complain about unfairness. But the conversation going on today is critically important. I look forward to hearing from the panel. But tell a friend that the AG's office is open for business to fight for consumers. What we heard in our earlier conversations is that everybody wants to be able to afford a home, to have a good, fair wage, and wants to live in an economic system that builds them up, not tear them down. We can help deliver those things piece by piece if we have to. Contract for deed is just one part of the puzzle that we can solve if we keep the big picture in mind. Thank you all very much. I look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Attorney General Ellison. And now I'm pleased to introduce Director Chopra. Director Chopra was sworn in by President Biden on October 12th, 2021 as the CFPB director, and prior to running the CFPB, he also served as a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission from 2018 to 2021. Director Chopra, would you like to come up?
Well, let me just build a little bit on what we just heard from Senator Smith and Attorney General Ellison and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. You know, we're supposed to have an economy that is about getting ahead, not setting people up to fail. And one of the things we learned in the lead up to the financial crisis of 2008, which really devastated parts of this area that had already been subject to historic redlining and other abuses, is that all of those issues, every single part of the financial crisis was avoidable. But what you saw was a lot of regulators and agencies watching from the sidelines throughout the 2000s as all of it went down. And part of the reason they did that is because they were totally disconnected from the reality and the lived experience of people who were experiencing those products and predatory practices. So one of the things we did as part of the CFPB is not just hide in Washington, but to make sure that every place we go around the country, we are seeing what is actually happening. You know, those subprime mortgages from 20 years ago, it used to be small, but then Wall Street breathed oxygen into it and it went widespread. So part of the reason we are here today is we want to make sure that the very harmful effects of this product in this community stop and that they do not spread. So today, I really want to focus on housing and mortgages, and it really just builds on exactly what the Lieutenant Governor was talking about. You know, in Minnesota and across the country, families are dealing with high costs of housing. For those who don't own a home, many are dealing with high rents that make it harder to save for a down payment. And for those who don't own a home, or who do own a home today, many feel they can't move because they've locked in this low rate and they look at the rates that are so high right now. So for many others, there's lots of other barriers. Some families may not have a long credit history, especially younger households or recent immigrants. Others are forced to compete with these cash buyers, private equity funds, big real estate investors, and still others are dealing with emerging troubles on homeowners insurance, flood insurance, and other things that are increasing costs. So we're working as part of an all-of-government effort to lower the costs of housing and reduce the barriers to homeownership. So as part of this work, we're on the lookout for those who are seeking to turn the dream of homeownership into a nightmare. So as was previously mentioned, Senator Tina Smith really talked to me about this and said something is happening in one of our communities and it's a problem. I came to Minnesota last year and the Attorney General introduced me to several of the local leaders who were explaining about these strange products and loans that were setting people up to fail. So we looked at this more broadly. And we are going to announce a whole set of actions today. First, we have published a report describing in detail the contract for deed market and what we have found. We're also issuing a legal policy that existing consumer protections on mortgages apply to these contracts for deed. And we're issuing a nationwide consumer advisory to warn people about the potential pitfalls with these loans. We already heard this from Senator Smith, but just to reiterate, contracts for deed are products where a seller is also the source of financing outside of the mainstream mortgage system. And these arrangements have a lot of names: contracts for deed, bond for deed, but when pushed by predatory lenders, they're often nothing more than a trap. Sellers, sometimes investment groups, and others seeking to profit target these contracts on families who believe they're shut out of mainstream opportunities to purchase homes, and they trade on the fear about the availability of affordable homes and limited housing inventory. The sellers know that first-time home buyers have been told they can't afford something else, so they offer contracts for deed as an attractive alternative. In one of these arrangements, the seller is also the lender. The buyer makes payments directly to the seller over time, living in the home, but not owning it outright until all the payments are made. Now, this might sound like a path to homeownership for those who feel they have no options, but it has real risks. The buyer doesn't get the deed until the property is fully paid off, which can take decades. The principal, interest rates, and fees are often way higher than with other financing. And if the buyer misses just one payment, they could lose the house and all the money they've paid so far, including payments for repairs, taxes, and insurance. Now, while contracts for deed were once in decline in the Twin Cities, in recent years the number of these loans has been increasing because sellers have been targeting very specific groups, including the Somali community. Contracts for deed have been marketed as interest-free alternatives to mainstream mortgage loans that may violate certain religious beliefs, but in reality, they may just be mortgage loans in disguise. The loans can come with inflated home prices, high interest rates, and tricks to increase the odds of foreclosure just so that the seller can start this cycle all over again. We heard about the efforts to stop some of this churning, this flipping, that every single family is just another way to pump up profits. And I'm glad the Attorney General has uncovered many of this in his recent lawsuit, including hidden balloon payments, high upfront payments that put the buyers immediately underwater, and inflated home values. Many of these players may be setting borrowers up to fail in payments they cannot afford, even though federal law was meant to stop that. Now, variations of what we're seeing in this area are happening across the U.S. Our report explains some of the history of contracts for deed and where they can make a family worse off. We're also issuing a formal legal interpretation that makes clear buyers are entitled to the protections provided for residential mortgage transactions under the Federal Truth in Lending Act. What this means is that large sellers, including investment groups, must clearly assess a borrower's ability to repay. They have to give clear disclosures about the loan before closing so borrowers know exactly what their payments are going to look like, and if the sellers and investment groups don't, they can be subject to stiff sanctions and borrowers themselves can take them to court. The CFPB is also making clear that many contracts for deed will trigger federal laws and regulations that apply to high-cost mortgages, including a restriction on balloon payments. And investors also need to understand that splitting sales among a series of sham corporations and LLC alphabet soup is not going to work. Not only does today's policy guidance warn lenders against ignoring their federal obligations under the Truth in Lending Act, but state law enforcement can point to our policy when they bring actions against contract for deed lenders under federal law. We're going to keep looking at this market, and I want to make sure that we're not going to see a repeat, this rinse-repeat cycle where big money investors back these shell companies of LLCs, and they get to hide while they end up profiting off of people's pain. So one of the main ways we learn about this is through our consumer complaints. I am not competing with your wonderful Attorney General, but the CFPB every day gets thousands at consumerfinance.gov. And what we do is sometimes we just see a few, but it turns out that it's happening all over the country. So we really value that. We want to hear from home buyers and potential borrowers about contracts for deed. We want people to come forward and submit complaints. When you submit complaints with us, we share it. with your Attorney General and others. And we've received multiple complaints about contracts for deed, including people who were lied to about whether they owned the home, people kicked out for single payments that were missed due to hospitalization, and higher than expected monthly payments. I think, like the Lieutenant Governor said, this is a small step, but it is part of many that we need to do to make sure that housing is going to work. The CFPB's doing a lot. We've taken action against tenant screening companies that are falsely matching people's names with other people and blocking people altogether out of housing. The CFPB has reinvigorated our work on redlining to rid the market of predatory and exclusionary home lending practices, including reverse redlining and digital redlining with algorithms and AI. We've finalized new rules to combat discrimination when it comes to appraisals. We also are working on ways to protect borrowers from payment shock when they face a cancellation of their homeowner's insurance. We're really continuing our work to make sure the mortgage servicers are playing fair. We've proposed some new rules recently to help more homeowners avoid foreclosure, with new ways for people to work with their mortgage servicer in their preferred language. You know, by the way, you see all this marketing in specific languages, and then later they don't help you. And so now we're going to try and fix that. We've issued policies to address so-called zombie mortgages to block debt collectors from seeking to illegally foreclose based on a second mortgage that was already satisfied or canceled. We're working on ways to lower closing costs that drain a down payment, including on how borrowers can navigate title insurance, that huge item on your closing cost form. We're examining ways to make it easier for a seller to transfer their low-rate mortgage to a buyer. We're also working on ways to make it easier to refinance when rates hopefully go lower. So in closing, I just want to thank everybody in the Twin Cities for helping inform us about this work. Everything we're going to talk about today is not just going to stay local, it's going to go national. And so again, I want to thank all of you for being here and who are going to share their own experiences and their own expertise with us. So I'm really pleased to call this CFPB field hearing to order.
Director Chopra. At this time, I'd like to invite the panelists to the stage, and while they're doing so, I'll briefly introduce today's panel. Our first panelist is Fartun Welly, who is Chief Executive Officer of eSaroon. We're also joined by Colleen Daly, Staff Attorney at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid. Also with us today is Sarah Mancini, Co-Director of Advocacy at the National Consumer Law Center. We also have on our panel Roxani Amantaris, Financial Counselor and Educator at Neighborhood Development Alliance. And finally, Johanna Osman, Executive Director at Sakan Community Resource. Thank you all for joining as panelists at today's discussion. Each of you has 3 minutes for opening remarks. We'll start with Fartun Welly, Chief Executive Officer of eSaroon, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Fartun Welly. I'm, as my sister said, eSaroon's lead. People ask me why we immigrated here in Minnesota, and as Somalis, we came from warm weather and no snow. And I tell them why not. We have people like Senator Tina Smith, Keith Allison, Lieutenant Peggy Flanagan. It's a place of opportunity. And so I just want to throw that out. We appreciate you, and also Somali legislators and PAPAC legislators. I was trying to be strong when I came this morning, not to get emotional or tear up, but eSaroon is meaning women who take care of ourselves. And women who take care of ourselves, we know it's not going to happen if our families are in poverty or in crisis. So our focus is to make sure that we see every service we do through the eyes of the mother. And Minnesota's huge disparity that our Lieutenant Governor talked about was we have a high female household led in Minnesota, Native Americans, African Americans, including us as Somali Americans. So the goal of Isrun is upward mobility. We triage poverty from day one, move into stabilization for all the services, and upward mobility. The biggest gift we give our families, or they take, is home ownership. As soon as families say we bought a home, it almost feels like we won $1 million, or the happiest day, and then contract for deed comes in and dismantles everything. You may ask why we're targeted. Firstly, as a Muslim community, we are prohibited for buying interest and making us susceptible to predatory lending, practices that exploit our beliefs. Second, many of Somali families, as I said, as so many pipeline women in Minnesota, led by women. Therefore, responsibility lies on, but there's a huge illiteracy, whether it's a financial illiteracy, or all the system navigation literacy. So that makes them really a victim. And lastly, the biggest asset we as immigrants have, and I was so happy to know that Latinos and other communities use, is lending circle. What we call, we don't use bank. Our aunts and our grandmas put together a bucket of money, and then that money is invested in the biggest, whatever we need to do, open a business, buy, and this time buying a home. And so this is what's happening. In Somali community, the last data we show, the smallest amount that these families are losing is $100,000. We have families who lost $250,000. They are moving back home. Some are ashamed. The divorce rate is getting higher. The depression is getting higher. This contract for a deed is against our dreams, and it needs to be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you, Fartun. Colleen, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Colleen Daly. I'm an attorney at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid. We represent lower-income folks in the Twin Cities area and statewide also. And I have worked a lot. I started at Legal Aid actually during the foreclosure crisis in 2007 and saw so many loans that were predatory and that sold people products that were clearly unaffordable from the beginning, and that were, we would see these loans that were sort of like, you can make the minimum payment, or the interest-only payment, or the fully amortizing payment. And folks, generally speaking, don't know what that means, and they say, oh, I can buy a house and make $800 mortgage payment. And then, come to find out, a year and a half later, they reset that to the 30-year amortizing rate, and it doubles the mortgage payment. And folks who put down payments and put money into the house are out all that money. So that was sort of my introduction to this sort of scam, predatory lending in the home ownership arena. And we have seen over the years many sorts of contract for deed predatory practices. We've seen, it kind of runs the gamut. We've seen landlords use contract for deeds basically as a way to get out of their duties as a landlord, to make repairs and keep up the property. So instead of using a lease, they would use a contract for deed. A lot of times tenants really had no idea. They're just signing something that to them is this is what you pay. They wouldn't record the contract, so nobody knows that this person has any interest in the property at all. And then they would just evict folks. And sometimes they would get some down payments, sometimes they wouldn't. But generally, they're getting out of their duties as a landlord and their requirement to get a rental license. Lots of cities around Minnesota require rental licenses for landlords. If you're selling on a contract for deed, you don't have to have a rental license as a landlord. And then we've seen most recently, this very egregious targeting of the Muslim community for using contracts for deed that are basically impossible to make work. And the ways that they're impossible generally are you're selling at an inflated price, you have in a few years a balloon payment that absolutely requires you to refinance. Because you haven't paid down hardly anything because of either the inflated price or the payments you're making are just too small to really pay down the principal. You can't refinance because you owe more than the house is worth, or there's no equity for a down payment, or the reason you went into the contract in the first place is because you had bad credit and now you have to refinance in 2-3 years and your credit isn't any better than it was because the contract for deed seller is not reporting these things. So it's And we do have a new state law that targeted this, which we can talk about more. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So imagine putting $10,000 down on a home you're buying. You had some issues with your credit, so you knew there was no way a bank would make you a loan. But you saw a company advertising their rent-to-own program through their Pathway to Homeownership program. So you scraped together $10,000 using your entire tax refund, borrowing money from family and friends, and you moved in. A few months later, the hot water heater broke and flooded the basement. And when you call the company, they say, well, you're in our Pathway to Homeownership program, so this is your problem. So you spend over $2,000 dealing with that issue, and as a result, you are late on your next monthly payment because you have really tapped everything out. And then from there, the company tacks on all kinds of fees and the problem spirals, and before you know it, you're hit with an eviction notice. Now you have a judgment and an eviction on your credit, and you're out $10,000, and you are farther away than ever from becoming a homeowner. For many people listening today, this is not just a nightmarish scenario. They have lived this. These rent-to-own contracts, contract for deed, and leases with option to buy overwhelmingly end in failure because much of the time they are built to fail because sellers make more money by kicking someone out and getting another person in the home, taking another large down payment based on their dreams of homeownership. We do not have to allow this kind of abusive, deceptive behavior in the marketplace, preying on the desire to own a home and punishing that desire, that ambition. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has stood up to block that kind of conduct in all kinds of settings. And that's why it is so important, Director Chopra, that you are here today calling attention to the abuses in this space and to what we can do about it, and taking these very important first steps to addressing these problems. And why it's also so important that lawmakers, like Senator Tina Smith, has proposed the Pathways to Homeownership Act to address these problems, and that the state of Minnesota, with the leadership of Attorney General Ellison and the governor and lieutenant governor, have enacted a really important step in the recent state law. The National Consumer Law Center's mission is to fight for economic justice for low-income and vulnerable consumers. We have been focusing on this problem along with legal services lawyers from around the country, and we thank the CFPB for rolling up your sleeves and being here today in communities that are impacted to fight for a basic fair shake for people striving to own a home.
Thank you, Sarah. Roxani, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Roxani Armendariz. I work for Neighborhood Development Alliance, a non-profit HUD agency located in St. Paul. We primarily work with the Latino community. And I came across, first of all, I'm very proud of this moment. I came across this situation around 3 years, a little bit more than 3 years ago. As a housing counselor, I met with a client that came in, and they were at their home. They received the visit from the sheriff, and the sheriff was stating, hey, you're trespassing, this is not your house, and they just didn't understood what was going on. Through our conversation, I find out that they have paid over $200,000 to the person that sold them their house, and at the time when they finished paying the house, they received a knock on the door by the sheriff saying that you were trespassing. And so I just didn't know what to do, so I reached out to legal aid, and I say, can you help me figure this out? This is just too clean. It just doesn't make sense. It seems like this has been done before. It's very calculated. And I just, from that moment on, I connected with Jessica from ProPublica, and she was trying to help me out figure out what was going on, and we come across a list of LLCs that were created, and they were the names of a lot of Latinos, and I couldn't let it go. Because it could have been any one of us. And I just started making calls to every one of our community members until somebody listened to what was going on. It's like, wait a minute, Latinos are buying in Minnesota. We're just being targeted a different way. And so I started calling people, thanks to the community members that say, okay, Roxani, let's figure this out. I remember and Megan at Exodus Lending, it's like, what can we do? How can we help you? What do you need? And I'm like, I need a voice. I need to be able to reach out and let people know what's going on. And it turned out that it was just not happening in the Latino community. It was also happening in the Somali community at a much larger level. And I am proud, and I continue to say that to you, I am proud of the Somali community for stepping forward, for not being silent, for not turning the other way and just saying this is not okay. And so this is how I came across this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxani. And finally, Johanna, would you like to provide your remarks?
Yes, please. Thank you for having this gathering. This is so important, and I'm so proud of what's happened in the last 3 years. Yeah. This is really amazing. I'm Johanna Osman, and I'm a director of an organization called Second Community Resource. We're a nonprofit organization in Bloomington, and our mission is to construct a pathway to housing stability in Minnesota that preserves people's religious principles, offers accurate financial information and coaching, leverages the community's resources, and enables them to attain comfortable and stable homes. It runs the gamut of rentals as well as home buying. We never even thought that we would be able to buy homes in this community. As we've all seen, within the Somali community, the Muslim community in general, there has been a real push to our Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to provide and allow the zero-interest mortgage companies that do exist and are very fair and very similar to a regular for-interest mortgage, but they truly are zero-interest mortgages. So our community that we serve mostly are large families. They've been living in Section 8 subsidized rentals. Their families are too big for these places, and they're not going to move out until they've got a place to go. So our first job was to do basic financial education, show people how they can live a life without dealing with interest, to stay within Islamic guidelines, and actually qualify to buy their own homes. So back in 2016, when we started, there was only one zero-interest mortgage company that operated in Minnesota, and they were really catering to the very wealthy. And we needed to change that. We really, the main thing we had to make sure of was that these families that wanted to buy homes could find down payment assistance. That was the biggest stumbling block. And this is pre-COVID, when things were affordable and it felt possible. So the step two was that we encouraged competition among the Islamic financing companies, and once there was competition, it really helped the community. The next step was to really fundraise throughout the community and get down payment assistance, because these odd zero-interest mortgages were not pairing with the down payment assistance. Things went well. Families started to buy homes. We say, they've told me that more than thousands of families have bought their homes through these zero-interest mortgages since 2016, 2017. But then what do we do with the families that don't qualify? And the reason they don't qualify, you've heard, mainly they're large. They have not been dealing with credit because they equate it with interest. So they can't qualify for a mortgage. So instead of working hard and taking time, they go to the next best thing, which their community member or famous person in, online is harping, and that was the contracts for deed. We, at Second, we were really uninformed about how the contracts were working, because we were focusing on getting people to qualify for the mortgages. And until families started coming to us, they were saying, we put all of our savings into that down payment because the house, the contract for deed seller bought that house for $350,000 because it's worth $350,000. But then they turn around to the family who has no alternative, and they sell it to them for $700,000. So automatically, even if they put 25% or 50% of the money down, they can't refinance because their debt is so much higher than the last time the house was appraised when the contract for deed seller bought it at $350,000. So that it just snowballed, and family after family got into these, and before they realized the disaster that they were in, 100 families had already gone through the same process. So we've heard the issues from each community and how they've been treated as really inhumanely. Second is now, we participated in that
Thank you, Johanna. I want to make sure we have enough time for the panel discussion.
Okay.
So I'll turn it over to Director Chopra to kick off the discussion portion, and he can follow up with you.
Well,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you all so much. And let me just start, if I could, if it's okay, Colleen, I might start with you, but open it up to everyone. Can you just share a little bit more how some of these are marketed? So, for example, are there certain people hired from within the community to offer them? Are there certain types of ways that people are steered into this? Is it usually for people looking to buy a home, or is it sometimes people looking to rent? I wonder if you can just start briefly, and then I'll turn it over to some of you.
Sure. I think some of our housing counselors might know this better than I even, but I know the situation that Roxani referred to. In that case, we did see there was some Latino real estate agents that were then marketing these contracts for deed to Spanish-speaking folks who maybe couldn't get a regular mortgage because of their credit, or maybe they don't have a social security number, or some other reasons why they would be unable to get a mortgage. So they often see, and in another case we saw where there was actually a pastor of a church who was, believe it or not, getting kickbacks from this seller who was, the pastor would refer families to the seller because we're going to help you buy a home when you couldn't otherwise buy one, and having these incredibly, undoable deals that just led to people losing money and losing their homes. And so it often is sort of within the community that we see these things being marketed.
Yeah, Roxani and I were nodding our heads in all of those examples. I heard about the first group that we learned about was they were being steered into these contracts for deeds through very green, new Somali realtors who really didn't understand the system. That was the south suburbs issue. Up in central Minnesota, a local sheikh, a famous person that everyone respected and trusted, was doing videos online, and also a famous Somali singer was also harping these things. that
Create a trust, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
At the end, I think that sellers often employ different marketing strategies to buyers into contract for deed. They make it sort of like attractive as the arrangement, and they use different methods such as radio advertisement, word of mouth referral, and just like Aline said, community-based, right? Like going to your own church where you're supposed to feel at peace, and marketing this product to the people. And so, and often, is Latinos preying on Latinos. And we just don't know. We just didn't know how to resolve it.
Director, if I could add one thing on this, I will just say that NCLC has heard from people around the country about this kind of targeting, both affinity targeting, people who look like me, linguistic targeting, and universally, these are being described as home ownership. You are becoming a homeowner. Many people we've spoken to did not understand that this was different than a regular mortgage. But absolutely, I know from Indiana, from their Fair Housing Center, we've heard of Spanish language advertisements. Casa en Pagos is a contract for deed, apparently in Spanish. And
Mi casa, tu casa, LLC. It was just
So a lot of targeting of people who prefer another language other than English, or immigrants and newcomers to the country.
Can I ask? Oh, please.
So I think the question about who is targeting and who is marketing is always these people come in when there's a huge gap that the government or other systems are not doing. So where there's a huge disparity of disconnect, then these predators come in and see the gap, but also they see the opportunity. They use the desire of one of our families put $250,000 down. She has twins with disability that now becoming teenagers. And when kids are teenagers, where we came from, we have our disabled family members at home. But here in America, now they became 18 or 17, you have to put them in a different way because they're going to adults. So these families are targeted based on a need that the system that we're in is not providing right now. Also, we are oral society. Opportunities, most of us, even if we read, I rather trust Abdullah telling me here's the shortcut, so then I don't have to go through all those. So these individuals who are targeting our families really see a huge disparity of what the system's not providing, and they're feeling that void with a scam and corruption.
Can I ask as a follow-up in terms of language? What language have the documents been in, and is it ever in English but targeted at someone who has limited English proficiency?
I have seen contract for deed that are just written in a piece of paper, and the client is showing me, I'm like, well, this is not a legal contract, it's just a piece of papers. And sometimes we see contract for deed that they're too hard to contest because they look so clean and it looks like everything was done according to the law. But the law doesn't define affordability, and so even though the contract was clean, we know that they're not going to be able to refinance out of this loan. And so how do we fix it?
And I'll just add that we have certainly seen examples where all of the communications orally were in Spanish or another language, but the papers are in English. And a few where the papers are in Spanish, but by and large, mostly the contract is in English.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is a huge issue across financial products, where it's sort of a bait and switch when it comes to the language and when it comes to what happens later, what's in the legal contract.
I think I wanted to, since we have opportunity, I want to make sure that when it comes down to language in Somali community, Somali language, English is older language. So you can't translate deed for contract into Somali because it could be someone who can't read Somali because civil law has been existing 30 years. Also, the two languages are not compatible. So instead of translating, what we do right now is actually hire a human being, an attorney, a paralegal, some of our younger folks that were born here while we were first generation, in having those one-to-one communication. That's a service that right now don't exist in many of our ethnic and immigrant communities. And absolutely in no way, shape, that Somali families will just have a deed for contract or any legal contract that is in English or translated into Somali, that they will read and then sign it. Majority of the contracts right now we have for deed that families have bought a house, they just sign it at the last page because the person that they have trusted said, oh, I've read everything, everything looks fine, go ahead and sign. So we need to consider about the illiteracy of the person, and we don't want to call them out and make them insecure. They're already feeling inferior because of the language barrier, being new. So what we do instead of focusing on interpreting the pages, we have actual staff that is multilingual, that understand the language.
Can I ask, maybe I'll start with Johanna. Are there examples of contracts for deed that you feel are safe and appropriate? And what are some of the features that, might satisfy and work for the family?
That's a great question. I appreciate that you asked that, because they're not all predatory. And when we were working on changing the regulations around this particular group of investors, sellers, and buyers that will occupy the home, I kept reminding the working group that there are some contracts for deed that are respectful of the buyers and are, yes. So we have a few that operate just locally, and they are either they go in like 5-year, they might be 20 years extendable, but they start with a 5-year, then a big balloon payment, and then 5 years and another, and could be refinanced anywhere in there. That has always been, we were very grateful that they agreed to do that for us. The other situation is, there was a local realtor who became very famous, one of the first ones that came out with this. When I pulled his contracts and read them, every payment was spelled out, and it talked about the total that they were going to pay, and if you added up all of the payments, it actually was that. But that was the only one guy, and I gave the Attorney General's office about 40 contracts, and that was the only one guy.
Others on this?
Yeah, I would say, I think certainly there can be terms of a contract that are fair and that make sense and that are doable. But I would just point out that there are some inherent risks to a contract for deed, no matter what the terms, and sort of those, I think one of the biggest ones is, when you buy a house, you're not going just with the seller and sitting down and signing papers. You have a real estate agent, you often have a broker, you have a title company. Yeah. So those people, they care. The bank cares, is the house worth what they say it's worth? The bank cares, are there title defects, and are there other problems with this property? Is this really a doable, can this person really pay this? And when you're just sitting down with the seller, you don't have any of those protections. Unless you know to get an appraisal, unless you know to get title work, you could be stepping into something that looks good on paper but has all these hidden risks. And the other sort of inherent risk is that the cancellation or termination period for a contract for deed is short. It's very short. In Minnesota, up until we just passed this new law, it's 60 days. You miss a payment, you get a notice that says you missed this payment. Unless you catch up, you will not own your home 60 days from now. So it's very short. There's no way, there's no public sale where you can get equity. There's no real time period for the seller or the buyer to turn around and sell the home, because 60 days just isn't enough. So compared to a foreclosure, it's just, it's very, very limited. So there are inherent risks, even when the terms are good terms, I would say.
Great. Let me ask a question that I know will be of interest to the AG and the Senator as well. What do you want to see the regulators and legislators do? Obviously, the CFPB is doing something modest today, but what else do you feel we all need to do to stop new forms of predatory mortgage lending and other ways to make sure that home ownership becomes more in reach for people? So I'll start with you, Sarah, and then open it up.
Thank you, Director. I think the most important thing for any law reform or regulatory efforts to rein in the abusive practices is to stop this fundamental incentive problem, to essentially stop contracts that are built to fail. And the best way to do that is to not allow a situation where a seller can cancel the contract and keep all the money paid and all of the equity and not give any of that back to a person who may have been paying for years and may have spent $20,000 or $30,000 on repairs. So we have to have policy reform efforts that address that incentive issue. And then I think enforcement is so crucial. So many of the folks that are drawn into these contracts are not going to find their way to a lawyer. So it's so important for our attorneys general and for the CFPB and other agencies to be out there looking for the bad actors and bringing enforcement actions, because it's very, very difficult for individuals to raise lawsuits themselves.
I would like to see an enforcement, meaning that when we find out that somebody's doing our community wrong, there's enforcement put in place. And I would like years ago, when the foreclosure crisis was taking place, a lot of people, we find out that they refinance out of good loans into bad loans. And I would love to see a program where people that are looking at purchasing a house under a contract for deed are required to receive counseling before they sign that contract for deed, so that they can understand exactly what they're signing. So make it a requirement. If it's a good contract for deed, it's going to be a good contract for deed, but they do need to understand the good and bad of those contracts.
So 3 things. First, we need to stop preventing more families. As we speak today, as I was preparing for this meeting, we got a couple phone calls yesterday that some new families are also being duped in getting a deed for contract. So I would like to get a pause. And then the second thing is, how do we get all the equity that was lost for these families? Some of these families that I've known, I've been here in Minnesota 24 years. Some of my colleagues that we went through ESL classes and did our master's degree together, who bought homes, and right now today they're just dead poor. We have fundings to pay their rent and we move in. So we need to prevent no more families coming in. Intervention, which is how do we get our families back on our fundings, money that went in, and then how do we address this desire of owning home to support our families that are working hard. Minnesota's immigrants and PIPEX give millions and millions of dollars of tax money. It's time for us to get some of those fundings to get back, and then we move out of these housing crises and these disparities we're in. So prevention, intervention, and then outward mobility. Without the 3 of them together, and I know talking to government and team, you have to choose where the problem is. But us addressing inequality in our state and United States, we have to do the 3. Prevention, intervention, prevention, and outward mobility, whatever that word is. Thank you.
You know, I would say also that one of the, and I think this is in Senator Smith's proposal, is a foreclosure, a more robust foreclosure protections for contracts for deed, so that, you know, not just this abbreviated period to cancel them. And the new Minnesota law has addressed a lot of that for investor sellers. So it's not for your, you know, if I own a home, live in it and sell it, it doesn't address that kind of a seller. It addresses folks who buy homes, turn around and sell them for profit, and they're doing this on a regular basis. And so there are a lot more robust protections now in place because of the new Minnesota law, where people do get more money back if there's a cancellation duration of 4 years. They get most of their down payment back, other than 10% of the purchase price. So if people are giving large down payments and then they get canceled, they can get some of that back. There's a lot of new disclosures that they have to be given. They get more time for, if you're an investor seller, it's actually doubled the time, so it's really 120 days to cancel the contract. So there are a lot of protections now in place in Minnesota due to this new law. But I think there still is room, because there's, if you're not an investor seller, but you might still sell somebody kind of a scam deal, just because that's what you can get away with it. And those folks really, that's not protected now in Minnesota. So I think foreclosure protections are huge, because it really does give people the opportunity to sell, capture their equity. If they have a lot of equity and there's a public foreclosure sale, the homeowner's entitled to a surplus, which does not exist in the contract for deed context.
Great. General Ellison, Senator Smith, any questions for the panel? You good?
I don't think so. I just so appreciate the feedback and the work that you all are doing in the community, and it's, I feel very blessed to have a chance to hear from all of you and further motivated to keep up this work.
First of all, Joanna, you were the first person who grabbed me and said, hey, you need to know about this. So thank you for that. We've got to create more ways for people to report to us. One of the things we worry about a lot of the AG's offices, that we are a complaint-based system. So if you don't know about us, then you're not complaining to us, and there could be this pocket. Somebody here with our office, I want to put her name as Catherine, she's the head of our civil rights group, and her job is to, wherever the economy is, we're targeting people. You mentioned affinity marketing. It's her job to say, if they're going after you because you live in a manufactured housing community that is like 98% Latino, that's going to be a problem. If contract for deed is going after you because you're Somali, and so she kind of operates like that. But I guess my question is, how can we overcome the barrier and the problem of only being responsive when we get complaints? Do you all have any advice for us? Because I'm sure that there's a lot of problems going on that may not come to our attention because people just don't know.
I could take a stab at that, Attorney General Ellison. I think the people, like the folks on this platform who are in communities, the legal services attorneys, the HUD-certified housing counselors, community organizations, oftentimes are so busy that they may not always reach out to public officials, but if you're able to reach out to them, they are hearing a lot. They are the canaries in the coal mine, and I know the CFPB tries to have regular engagements with legal services attorneys, people like that who are in community. I think that's one helpful way to get that information coming in, but sometimes, again, it's hard for all of us to remember to do that.
I think, thank you, and I know you guys, Keith, our AG and the office helped a lot, and we have speed dial on, but you have to understand, as ethnic communities serving our own ethnic, we're often in triage in poverty and associated crisis with. So it's almost privileged to look up and say, let me call the AG's office. So as ethnic-led institutions, we do not have the capacity to, I think, how many of us, 32 of us, and we're all navigators of crisis management. So it's really, I'm going to just thank you for being available to us, but it's also your office and other offices consistently engaging us. Maybe have once a month, 1 hour, stop by the office, collect information. But if you wait us, our families also are waiting when they're on the last eviction notice, because there's so many other priorities and other fires that they're putting out. And we as ethnic institutions that are helping, we're also right there with them putting out the fire. So we don't have the privilege to say, give me a break, let me make step 2 for you. So it really just, right now, is just asking your team and Senator Tina Smith and others just coming to us as ethnic, saying, hey, what's up? I'm just going to come and have a tea. Just sit there on office and get 2 hours or an hour a month. But you have been, your office has been incredibly responsive, and our community likes you and respects you.
Let me just supplement what the AG mentioned, which is I hope also everybody here who is a leader in their community, or we can all do a little bit to make financial struggles less shameful. There's a big sense of personal shame. You know, it's really funny when large companies file for bankruptcy to get rid of or reorganize their debt. You know, they're praised for restructuring, but when consumers file for bankruptcy protection, there's a moral dimension of this that is very unsettling to me. And by the way, this cuts across, I think, lots of different groups throughout our society. So we actually need to make sure that when people are struggling financially, they can sometimes know who to go for help, when to report, and when to make sure, what we can do to make them feel comfortable and safe when it comes to speaking up. So I know that that is something that Senator Smith and General Ellison, we all like to think about, because we want people to feel that they have more power in their lives. And I think that's really a big reason why we do this. So I think I'll turn it back to Angela. Let me just ask everyone to give a big thanks to all of our panelists today who joined us.